All right, Dr. Liz Litzler has graciously agreed to come and speak with our group about community cultural wealth, program evaluation, and ASE/ECD/EI. And I want to highlight that this is sort of 3 chunks. And so where many of these sessions have been one longer presentation followed by some time of Q&A. I think she's going to pause at times and we'll have a little bit of Q&A before she jumps to the next session. Also, she has said to go ahead and use the chat. By default, if you type in the chat, only the panelists will see it, but you can click the little arrow and change it so that everyone can see. Liz Litzler is the director of the University of Washington Center for Evaluation and Research for STEM Equity, as well as affiliate faculty with the University of Washington Sociology. And our panel knows of her because she is also currently the chair or program director of the ASEE Council Committee for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
Commission.
Commission. Oh no, commission. Okay. Anyway, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Robin, and it's to Cindy for inviting me today. You already sort of told all the basics of who I am, and I'll also add that my PhD is in sociology, so I'm not an engineer, and I use she or they pronouns, and also I've been studying engineering and STEM education and this work for about 18 years now, so I've been doing this work for a while. I will jump right into it, but as Robin mentioned, please feel free to put comments and questions in the chat, and I'll try and watch those as I'm going along and address things as needed, and definitely leave time for questions at each section. So the center where I work, which we fondly call CERSE, S-C-E-R-S-E, but that's how we pronounce our acronym, our mission is really to improve equity and broaden representation in STEM fields. And we really do that through the integration of research, evaluation, and consulting. We utilize multiple methodologies for the work that we do, whatever method is the right thing for the questions we're trying to answer. We believe our values are also around building relationships and using a critical orientation or a social justice lens. So we believe that, as I'm sure all of you do, that STEM fields should be equitable and accessible for all people. And we have to make significant changes to make that happen. So the first thing I want to talk about today is community cultural wealth, which is some work that I started doing many years ago, 6-ish maybe years ago now. And there's some, I'll share a little bit about the first study that I did in community cultural wealth, but just so you know, I'll also share some of the ongoing work that we're doing on assets-based frameworks for understanding marginalization in STEM fields. So go with me for a minute on this analogy. I'm just going to see how far it goes, and I'd love for you to tell me if you think it's a bad analogy or like where the errors lie in the thinking. But this is just one way to think about it, is that students are the flowers. And for many years as a community, like, for the past 20 years, 50 years, whatever, we have been focusing on why the students were wilting or not growing when they're in engineering. And we talked about, oh, they must have been grown in bad soil or not gotten enough vitamins, or maybe they couldn't get access to sunshine. But those flowers were doing just fine when they were still rooted. It was when they finally went to college, when they were, cut and went to college, that we started blaming their struggle to thrive on background factors rather than the present day factors in their environment. And so thinking about institutions being the vases or the vases, which are the more of where the problems lie. So maybe there's not enough water in those vases. Maybe they're designed for only one type of flower. Maybe they're so enormous that when you put the one flower in there, like they're just, flopping around, they can't find their fit. So I don't know if this is the right analogy. I was just feeling it when I was putting this together. But it makes me think about how assets-based approaches like community cultural wealth really help us see how each of us brings something that makes the whole better. And critical race and feminist approaches also help us focus on the root causes of the lack of institutional support, inclusion, and equity within institutions. So these kinds of assets-based frameworks are receiving more visibility these days. I think we're in a wonderful way. I'm really happy that this is happening. So you've probably heard about these frameworks, but if you can indicate maybe in the chat any, like if this is new to you, is community cultural wealth a new concept, for example, or is this something you're relatively familiar with? And I'll kind of watch, I'm gonna keep on giving you a little bit more context, but I'll see that those chats as you come in. So for me, this work around community cultural wealth and assets-based frameworks really started when I was doing work on the project to assess climate and engineering, or the PACE study. And this was a Sloan-funded study that started in 2008. But went for like 7 or 8 years. We did work on this, and we worked with, this particular analysis was of some interviews that we did with students across 11 universities, but the whole PACE study had like 19 universities, and we did quantitative and qualitative analysis. So this, it's good to see that there's at least some folks for whom this is new information, but others are familiar. YOSO is really the foundation for the work that we did early on, and this is the idea that community cultural wealth is basically the types of capital that are developed in and nurtured by families and communities. And so it extends sociological theorist framework, Bourdieu, his capital framework, by providing sort of a broader perspective on how different cultural attributes can serve as resources for students as they navigate educational institutions. So the whole idea in part is that this lens helps us problematize the experiences, especially of students of color, in the context of an educational system that is designed for white males. So a little bit of some of the key results from the qualitative work that we did around community cultural wealth was that there are multiple forms within each type of community cultural wealth. I'll talk about a few about the types and sort of reference some of the forms that we saw. Navigational and aspirational capital were by far the most commonly described by students. And gender differences, this is another thing that we believe is really important in the work that we do at CIRCE, is looking at the intersections of identity with our results. And so we did look at gender and race ethnicity as at the intersection of those. So we found gender differences were especially striking among our African-American students, and that the racial and ethnic differences that we saw were most prevalent among women. So I'll tell you a little bit about each type, the key types that we saw, not all the types, because some of our data didn't allow us to speak to some of the types of community cultural wealth. But navigational capital was by far the most commonly shared type of resource that students drew upon when they went to college. Pretty common except for the African-American men who were in our sample. But this was one of those types of capital where the women differed. So African-American women and Latina women differed greatly on navigational capital. I should say greatly, like this is all small numbers. And so percentages, we considered anything greater than a 40% difference because we're talking about the difference between 8 students on one hand and 5 on another. So navigational capital is really about learning to navigate educational institutions that have dominant cultural norms. It's also related to the capacity to maintain high levels of achievement despite stressful conditions, which students of color certainly experience in white supremacist organizations, which are all of our institutions and universities that have white supremacist backgrounds. And it really also includes drawing from experience to enhance subsequent functioning and resilience. So that's sort of a big, broad view of navigational capital. Aspirational capital was the second most common type of capital that folks talked about. And aspirational capital can be described as like an individual's future hopes and dreams, their career goals and aspirations. It helps them, their aspirations basically help them maintain their dreams for the future, regardless of their barriers. So those aspirations kind of push them to persist, for example. And in many cases, in terms of aspirational capital, the students were, when they were talking about things, they're actually things that reflect on both aspirational and navigational capital. So those two often had a lot of overlap when students were talking about them. This one was the most common type shared by our African American students that were in our group. And again, we saw some significant differences between African American women and Latino women on this particular one. Resistant capital is another type of capital that has multiple forms, but you can think about resistant capital as students like responding to negative stereotypes or microaggressions by succeeding, like showing or disproving a stereotypes, or proving others wrong in terms of their assumptions. It can include responses to injustice through different kinds of strategies. So it can be kind of conformist resistant capital, where you're utilizing the, you're not dismantling the master's house, you are using the same tools, you're not actually pushing change forward necessarily. Or resilient resistance, which is also, enlisting strategies that leave the dominant structures in place, even while you're trying to change stereotypes. So again, we saw some interesting things going on in terms of the men here, the African American men, the Latino men had some significant differences in the prevalence of descriptions of resistant capital. And then also within African American students, there were some differences between men and women there. And then finally, the last type of capital that I want to just share broadly with you is familial capital. And this showed up mostly as family as being motivation for students, and also community well-being, where students were focused on like supporting younger students that were in the community with them. And the students across all the different groups were actually not that dissimilar. There weren't large differences between any of the groups on familial capital. And then for some of the new work that we're doing, we're currently working on a project, a research project as part of the LSAMP grant that we have. It's our phase 3 grant, so it has a much larger research component in it, and we are doing the research, and we're trying to push really hard against this individual look at institutionalization, and instead focus on how assets are or are not recognized by the institutions in which students learn. And so again, trying to shift that focus even more. We do have 2 papers that we have been working on for ASEE, which of course, once they get published, everyone will be able to see those and have access. But I just wanted to sort of wet your whistle with some ideas here. The first article is going to be about anti-racist institutional transformation and how that matters, talking about both community cultural wealth and counter space processes. And again, that's really focusing on like, how can what we know about counter spaces and how LSAMP functions as a counter space, and other groups on campus function as counter spaces, and how can we use that information to understand the places where institutions are failing us. And then, is anyone familiar with quant-crit, like the quantitative critical work or critical theory? We're trying to find, there has been some work done on community cultural wealth to sort of make a quantitative measure of it, but it hasn't been within STEM fields. And so we're using some of our prior qualitative work to push on and try and measure community cultural wealth from a critically quantitative perspective. So I think that's it for this section. So what questions? I'm glad to see that some of you are familiar with QuantCrit in the chat. That's awesome. What questions do you have about this part? Now I want to read Corin Bowen's paper. So question, for the percentages of groups of students who talk about these things, I imagine some of those look different for different groups. Did you also code how they talked about them? Oh, like if familial capital might be different if a parent is an engineer. We did have some codes about like whether someone had an engineer in their family. And I think that that is something that, you know, it gets really complex and specific pretty quickly once you start getting down at that level. So we found it hard to bring that information into the work that we were doing. But I think you're absolutely right. I think we heard some different things based on students, communities and backgrounds. And then let's see, there's, I see a navigational capital might be different in first gen. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. Unfortunately, we did not have information about whether folks were first generation status from our qualitative data. We did have that from the quantitative data though. I think to Cindy's question, can you tell us a few takeaways of your research? What can we do to make a difference? I think some of the things that I've always continued to think about with respect to this work is there are ways in which we can help students to develop more resistant capital, even within the context of organizations. So right now, when students are, coming in and they, for example, feel a need for social justice, but they're not actually critiquing oppressive systems or realizing that the systems in which they operate are already oppressive. So if we can help educate them that like the experiences they're having are not because they're not good enough. The experiences that they're having are because the system is built in a way that disadvantages people with their backgrounds and experience and knowledge. And so I think there's some, in some ways, consciousness building for all students around the way our institutions are built to advantage some and not others. That's similar, it goes along with this idea of like the myth of meritocracy and making sure that people understand that is a myth. Like that is, meritocracy is actually not how our systems are set up and our institutions are set up. And so if we can help people understand that, that's like it's still an individual level change or shift as well, though. So I think the other side of that is how can we make the environments to be less raced and gendered, and that's a much bigger conversation. So let's keep thinking about that, and maybe we could talk about that more in the later sections. I want to move on to the next section because I don't, again, like, and if you have questions about this that come up throughout other sections, then please take a note or put them in the chat and we'll try and come back to them later. So the other part of my world, I do research, I do program evaluation, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the service that I do with the CDEI. But program evaluation is what I like to think of as me using my social science skills for good and for change in ways that are much more sort of applied. And so can I get a sense from folks who is familiar with program evaluation? Has anyone been, and this is not like evaluating whether a particular mechanical engineering program is fulfilling like, requirements to be accredited. This is not accreditation program evaluation. This is like you get a grant from NSF or NIH to do work, and then I or my center, CERSI, or another organization would help you to basically holistically measure your impact of that grant, help you identify areas that you can improve, and also help you gather data to help you tell your story. That's great. And I'm seeing in the chat that there are some folks familiar and some folks not familiar, which is good because hopefully I'll have something for everyone here. And I also, of course, I do know that Mark has received many a survey from me over the years due to some of my work with other organizations. So that's pretty funny. One of the things that at CERSI we specifically think about with our program evaluation is our own diversity, equity, and inclusion expectations and how we do evaluation. And so we really believe that if we want to live our DEI values, and if the people that we work with and collaborate with want to live their DEI values, that we need to co-create our expectations by being explicit and upfront about what we're expecting to get out of this relationship and what it will look like. And of course, a DEI perspective reminds us that good intentions are not enough. We can't just intend to do good things. We actually have to attend to the impact that we're having through the way that we are working with others and through the work that we're actually doing. Another thing about evaluation is that we do believe that this is not like evaluation is a professional field, just FYI. Like this isn't a thing that is just something that like you can just slip into it. I kind of slipped into it from my social science side, but there's a professional association where thousands of people come to annual meetings and we all learn from each other about evaluation and all that. But interpretation of the data can be an art. They can help you your evaluator can help you hold up a mirror to your project, but you really have to be willing to see what's in the mirror. And so one of, oops, wow, I just really used my scroll bar there. So evaluators can really, in part, sometimes because they have experience from other projects. So we can help you understand, for example, if your results are typical, or, if you're thinking, oh, I want to try this thing, and we can say, oh, that might be able to work, but here's how it worked in this other project that I worked on. I did mention, there are folks, evaluation can be a career path. I think even for engineering education folks, it could be or it could be a side gig that you might do, for example. But if you're interested in learning more about evaluation as a career path, the American Evaluation Association is that professional society that I mentioned. I really like this article by Jane Davidson. It's called Unlearning Some of Our Social Scientist Habits. And it's really short. It's like, I feel like it's maybe 5 pages, but it's relatively short, but it kind of describes like how an evaluative perspective can be different than a research perspective, and how evaluators, and in my opinion, how evaluators can sort of help projects in ways that research that kind of reserves judgment on how things should move forward. Evaluation doesn't do that as much. It kind of helps you move forward in different ways. And then if you're not familiar with evaluation at all, period, I think that this is a relatively old resource, but it's still pretty basic and a nice way. The 2010 user-friendly NSF handbook for program evaluation or project evaluation can be helpful for folks if you just want to get an overview of the kinds of things that evaluators think about. And then lastly, for this section, as I mentioned, I often think of evaluation as using my research skills in an applied way to help make change happen. And one of the things that I love about the evaluation work that I do is that I can see, like, I can give recommendations and then the program will shift something for the next year. And then you can see the positive impacts, like, right away. And I feel like sometimes when we're doing research, we might put those ideas out there and we just don't see the results of the interventions in quite a specific way. So it feels really applied and really like I am part of the solution rather than part of the problem to some extent. So on here, there are two different parts of the CIRCE website. On our evaluation tab and on our research tab, there are some resources that you might find useful. We've created two questioning guides. One is a critical evaluation questioning guide and one is a critical research questioning guide. And these are both meant to help researchers and evaluators really think about whether the way we're doing our work is in line with our values. So it's going to ask questions like, to what extent are our stakeholders being involved with the decisions that are being made with the research or with the evaluation? It's a reflective tool basically for folks to use. We also have a setting evaluation expectations resource, which we found helpful with new collaborators that we work with. So we can kind of talk through questions like, how do you want to receive feedback from us? Do you want this to be, written? Would you prefer to read it and then we can talk about it? Or do you want to just talk about it and then, we can work on revising things? So there's lots of different expectations that really need to be set at the beginning of an evaluation relationship to make that relationship work well, I think. And then we have some webinars that we've done with other groups, with ASEE and TechAid, the TechAid project around evaluation for DEI. So next, this is the second set. Do you have questions about program evaluation? And really anything here is totally fair game. A general example of those who aren't familiar with this work, sure. So for example, so there are grants that are called STEM grants, which are scholarships for STEM students who come from low income but are high achieving students. And this is an NSF grant. And we do evaluation of multiple kinds of STEM grants. And so the STEM grants might have particular goals that they're trying to achieve, for example, around student sense of belonging, or they might be trying to achieve particular goals around math skills because they feel like the students that are coming in, are not passing the certain math tests that they need to as quickly. And so what we would do is we would help them to measure the progress that their students are making and the experiences that their students are having in their program with respect to building their professional skills, building their sense of belonging. And we also do things like for evaluation, sometimes we help measure and document dissemination of the project so that the project overall can make sure that they are, they're able to articulate like the reach that they've had with the different presentations and that they have done. Tershia is asking, do you primarily work with your institution only? If someone wanted to have someone from CERC do some program evaluation, what's the process for that? We work with folks all across the country. And in fact, of our portfolio of projects right now, which we have 30 some projects, like 35-ish right now, I think, maybe less than a quarter are focused at the University of Washington. Most of them are at different places across the country. And if you were interested in working with us, then you could certainly contact me. That's usually the first place to start. We do have, since I'm the director, I sort of take in most of those requests and sort of figure out who might be able to work on a proposal or something like that. And it also just depends on our capacity for taking on new proposals too. And we can always recommend other evaluators if we aren't able to help you at any given time. All right, how do you approach people who are concerned about being evaluated? I think this is one of the things that this can be really hard, and this is part of why those conversations up front are important, is that our goal is to be really your collaborative partner when we're doing evaluation for a project, and is not to grade you. We're here as like a critical friend to help you make sure that your project succeeds. And so that, I think, coming in with that perspective, I think sometimes it's useful also to describe how we're not evaluating particular people, we're evaluating a program rather than like a person. And so that can also be helpful to allay some fears. Let's see, in my experience, I find that education research type projects often require an evaluator. Yep, we've seen that too, but other fields don't often require an evaluator. So that is, we've seen that as well. The grants that we work on that are with like chemistry or biology are often grants that have educational components as part of larger technical work. So like a national research traineeship grants, the NSF NRTs, like a huge portion of that is like technical research. And there's nothing that we could do to help them with evaluating that work, but we do help them often with the educational portions of the work that they're doing. Could you discuss an experience you had where folks you evaluated weren't willing to look in the mirror? And how you navigated that? Oh, this is a good question. I think part of this is, some of how people respond is how it's delivered. And so being careful about how this is something we think about all the time, and what our existing relationships are with the people that we're delivering the message to. I think there's certain ways in which you can try to like reiterate the finding. So if you say like, your African-American women students just are not feeling like they're part of the program like your other students are. And then you hear back like, oh, but this one student says she loves it. And you can say, you just have to kind of reiterate in very nice ways that the overall message, to make sure that, they understand. And the truth is, in the end, like there's nothing that as the evaluator I can do to make them do or think anything differently. This is why part of the work is persuasive work, to help folks understand, how they might need to shift their work a little bit more. And I feel like we need to move on. There's one more question here. Do you have any particular advice to improve the sense of belonging of students in a given department? I think that's a really big question. I think there are lots of different interventions that can possibly help that. And I think it depends on the context of that department and what's going on with it. So often if you can get students who might lead some sort of student-led group to get people to feel part of the department. That can help. I've had other organizations that have, paid, subsidized, like, it's kind of funny, but like sweatshirts for their students, so that everybody feels like, proud to say that they're part of computer science or mechanical engineering or whatever the case is. It improves that sense of identity to some extent, which is not the same as belonging, but I think it's harder during COVID times as well to try and address this sense of belonging when people are not meeting in person and able to actually develop relationships, because it's the relationships that are developed that make the difference. There's one more really looks like a good question in here. I feel like, Robin, is it okay if I answer this one and then wait to go on?
You can make all the decisions here.
Okay. So the other question okay, so how do you navigate power relations? For example, we worked with a 100-person lab with an active student group that was committed to DEI, but staff and faculty who were more resistant. This is a really common problem that we see, and we've done, Cersei has worked on multiple climate studies of different departments and colleges, and this is a common issue that we see. I think power relations are embedded in this work always. There are always going to be people in the work that have more power than others, and I think we have to attend to those things and try to elevate the voices of those who are not in power and who do not have the power. And that's part of what we see our role as evaluators is of doing as well. I think that if there are ways to help, again, build relationships, to even one-on-one relationships with staff and faculty who maybe are a little bit more resistant, but could be convinced in a more one-on-one conversation, those are ways in which we might try to push, or we might suggest to try and push departments forward a bit more. I love all these questions. I want to keep thinking about them, but I'm going to move on, and maybe we can keep talking about this during the final part. So right now, I am the current chair of the ASCE Commission on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. CDEI, we used to be called the Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, but this past year we became a commission. We are a commission of the Board of Directors of ASCE, so we are appointed by the president. We don't have a paper program like divisions do. There's a bunch of stuff that like we can do that divisions can't do, but a ton of stuff that divisions can do that we can't do. We kind of are an advisory mechanism too. So ASCE sometimes comes to us with like, what does CDEI think about this thing that we're thinking about? So I'm the current chair, Susan Walden is the past chair, and Jeremy London is the incoming chair. And together we're the sort of the chair team. And broadly, we envision, we want to see widespread, inclusive, equitable environments in engineering and academia, in industry that all embrace individual differences and leverage diversity for a better engineered tomorrow. I want to give you a bit of a broad, so this is one of the things, even before I became chair, I never really understood like the structure of CDEI. And if someone had asked me 3 years ago, like how, what member category are you in CDEI? I'd say I have no idea. But standing members are members of CDEI who are actually appointed by the ASCE president. So they're part of our executive committee, basically. And you would know if you're a standing member because you'd be invited to our executive committee meetings every month. Delegates are appointed by your divisions as liaisons. Not all delegates have a liaison to CDEI, so there are still some delegates that we need representatives from. And so if you don't know who your division's delegate might be, you could always ask your chair, and maybe you could become the delegate and basically be a good conduit for sharing information back and forth from CDEI to your division. And then friends are folks who are interested in contributing to the work. And if you are not on our mailing list or part of our organization, you can become a friend. All you have to do is join our mailing list to become a friend. And that's on the CDEI website, which is a sub-site on the diversity website of ASCE. There's a link down there at the bottom of the screen. CDEI has 7 different committees which is basically like kind of where a lot of the work gets done. And we always need folks to volunteer for these committees. We find that these committees are both a great way to sort of contribute your talents, but also to expand your network. So you get to know much better the people that are on those committees, and you build a more national network that way, which is good when it comes to tenure decisions and other things where you have to, point out people who are aware of your work more nationally. A few highlights of what we've been working on this year. We've been doing a lot of workshops, professional development workshops, as well as other kinds of content sharing. We've been highlighting scholars in the engineering education community on our blog. We have what we're calling scholar spotlights. And so there are 4 scholar spotlights up on the blog right now. So, and you get kind of a personal and professional view of these scholars in these blog posts. I think it's a really nice mix of, highlighting these people as scholars and as individuals and people. We also have we invite people to submit guest blogs to the CDEI blog. And so far we've only had 2 guest blogs, but I'm hoping that, if you're working on a proposal or a grant or some other kind of research and you want to share some of your results that have, really important implications for how people do things or behavior, we want you to submit your idea for a guest blog post. And they're on the CDEI website. There's a place to submit those ideas. Oh, Tricia, thank you for putting that link in there. We also have had, and it may be more than 16 virtual workshops by now, but we've had a bunch of virtual workshops that are all on YouTube. And so you can go to our YouTube playlist that's linked on our site as well, and find different workshops on any different number of topics. And we suggested, and some people have used those as kind of like, if you have like a reading group or like a lunch group, you could have everyone listen to one and then you could talk about it and discuss after the fact. We have a Cultivating Inclusive Communities, which was kind of like a community of practice that we kicked off this past year. They're not open right now to more people joining the small groups, but we are having this work in progress feedback series for people to come and to network, and also just to say here's this work I'm working on, I'm really struggling with it, I need some feedback from others. And so that's another opportunity for engaging with your colleagues who care about diversity, equity, and inclusion across the country. And then I am super, super, super excited to share with you the information that next year, which is the 2021-2022 Society Year, which starts right after the annual conference ends, will be designated as the Year of Impact on Racial Equity. So some of you who have been around the ASCE community for a while know that there have been prior years that have been called Years of Action, like a Year of Action on Diversity happened 5-ish years ago. There was a P12 commission, had a Year of Action on P12 sorts of things. And we really wanted to focus, and Jeremy London, who will be our chair next year, will of course be really leading this as the chair. But on a year of impact. We really want to focus on having an impact, and we really want to focus on racial equity. And we believe that this is a great time to increase momentum for change. And so we have kind of 3 tiers of work that we're hoping to do around engaging engineering students by empowering student organizations. We'll have an actual design competition to have them think about how they can apply the engineering design process to equity challenges within their institutions. We're hoping to get an engineering dean's council to help push forward a challenge to colleges of engineering to improve policies and practices. And then we are also going to work with the P12 Commission to focus on reaching out to P12, to outreach to P12 children, to Black and Brown children, and have some monetary awards for some of that work as well. So we will be sort of introducing this work at this year's annual conference broadly, but we will be starting, really strong this summer after the conference in terms of trying to figure out how to actually make all this happen, and then to catalog the work that is being done with the Year of Impact. So we really do need all of your help, both on all of our committees, but especially to make the Year of Impact on racial equity amazing. And so I'm sure that there will be ways that people can contribute in, with more significant time commitments, but we are always also looking for people who are willing to do some work for 10 hours a year or something. That's a relatively minor time commitment. So that is it for the section on CDEI. What questions do you have?
I can stop the recording and promote everyone to panelist if we want to have this as a verbal back and forth instead. Okay.